I didn't say a single word when the woman in the white Lexus told me I was standing on HOA property, because at that exact moment I was holding a folded deed in my hand that proved something she clearly had no idea about. Every single house behind her, every mailbox, every perfectly trimmed lawn, every inch of asphalt in that neat little suburban neighborhood sat inside the 1,000 acres I had just inherited. The Texas wind rolled across the hill where I stood, carrying the dry smell of sun-baked grass and distant cedar, and from up there I could see the whole subdivision spread out below like a board game someone had carefully arranged. Rows of identical roofs, cul-de-sacs curling through the land, sprinklers ticking rhythmically in the afternoon heat. 73 homes, maybe more. Kids riding bikes along sidewalks that hadn't existed 10 years ago. A clubhouse with a bright blue pool glinting in the sun. All of it sitting right in the middle of Carter Ranch. My ranch. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave, the woman said again, her voice tight and rehearsed, the way people talk when they're used to being obeyed. She held a clipboard against her chest like a badge of authority. Linda Whitmore, HOA president, according to the gold nameplate clipped to it. She glanced at my dusty pickup truck parked along the gravel shoulder, and then back at me, clearly deciding I didn't belong here. I looked past her shoulder toward the stone entrance sign at the bottom of the hill, Willow Creek Estates, established 2018. The polished granite letters sparkled in the sun. Funny thing about that date. My grandfather bought this land in 1962, back when this entire valley was nothing but cattle, mesquite trees, and a single dirt road winding through the hills. He used to bring me here every summer when I was a kid. I could still remember the crunch of gravel under his old boots, the smell of diesel from his tractor, the way he'd point across the open land and say, "Danny, someday this place will matter more than people realize." At the time I thought he meant the cattle. Turns out he meant something else entirely. 3 weeks ago the lawyer in Austin called to tell me my grandfather's estate had finally cleared probate. I expected a few dozen acres, maybe the old house and some pasture. What I didn't expect was 1,000 acres of hill country land, and a stack of county records thick enough to stop a door. The first time I unfolded the survey map, my coffee nearly spilled across the table. The boundary lines stretched across the page like a giant rectangle swallowing everything inside it. Roads, creeks, hills, and right there in the middle of it, a perfectly drawn neighborhood grid labeled Willow Creek Estates. I thought it had to be a mistake. Developers don't just build 70 houses on someone else's land. Counties don't approve roads, permits, and utilities without checking ownership. At least that's what I used to believe. But the more records I pulled, the stranger it got. Tax parcels that didn't match surveys. Easements filed under outdated descriptions. A developer who'd quietly started building 5 years ago when the Carter estate was tied up in probate paperwork nobody bothered to untangle. And somehow, piece by piece, a whole neighborhood had grown right in the middle of land that had never been sold. Down below, a garage door hummed open and a man backed out his SUV, waving to a neighbor walking a golden retriever along the sidewalk. Normal life. Weekend barbecues. HOA meetings about mailbox paint colors and lawn height. None of them had any idea what the county map in my truck showed. Linda shifted impatiently. "Sir, if you don't leave I'll have to call security." I finally looked at her, then slowly folded the deed back into my pocket. The paper felt rough against my fingers, old but very real. From the hilltop the entire neighborhood shimmered in the afternoon heat, peaceful and perfectly organized. And sitting quietly underneath all of it was 1,000 acres that still legally belonged to my family. I took one more look across the rooftops and thought about what my grandfather used to say about patience. Because the truth was, I didn't come here to argue with an HOA president. I came here to confirm something. And now that I had, the people living in Willow Creek Estates were about to discover that the land beneath their neighborhood had a history they'd never been told about. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked back down the hill toward my truck, the late afternoon sun sitting low over the Texas hills and throwing long shadows across the neighborhood that technically did not know it was sitting on someone else's land. The warm air smelled like cut grass and sprinkler water drifting from the lawns below, the kind of quiet suburban afternoon people move here for. It almost made me laugh. Because 3 weeks ago, I did not even know this place existed. My name is Daniel Carter. I am 38 years old, a civil engineer by trade. The kind of guy who spends most of his days staring at infrastructure drawings and arguing about drainage plans with city inspectors. I have spent the last 15 years designing roads, culverts, and water systems across Texas. And if there is one thing you learn in that line of work, it is that land records never lie. Paperwork might get lost. Bureaucrats might miss things. But land does not forget who owns it. My grandfather understood that better than anyone I have ever known. Henry Carter bought this ranch in 1962 when this entire valley was still considered the middle of nowhere. Back then, the nearest grocery store was 20 miles away, and the only road into the property was a narrow gravel track that twisted through cedar trees and limestone hills. He paid $48,000 for the entire 1,000 acres, which even in those days people said was a gamble. Oil companies had already passed on the land. Farmers thought the soil was too rocky. But my grandfather used to say the value of land was never about what it was today. It was about what it would become when everyone else finally noticed where the highways were going. I still remember riding beside him in his old Ford truck when I was 8 years old, watching dust roll behind us while cattle moved slowly across the pasture. He would point toward the hills and talk about how cities grow like slow-moving rivers, always expanding outward. Austin was 2 hours away then. Now the edge of the metro area sits less than 40 miles from here. Development has been creeping closer every year like a tide you cannot see until it is already at your doorstep. That is why when the lawyer called 3 weeks ago and said the Carter estate had finally cleared probate, I expected paperwork and maybe a few property tax headaches. What I did not expect was the survey map. I remember spreading it across my kitchen table that night, the paper smelling faintly like old archives and printer ink. The bold black boundary lines showed exactly what my grandfather bought in 1962. 1,000 acres stretching across this valley. Creeks, hills, and one long access road running along the eastern ridge. And right in the middle of those lines sat something that did not exist on any map from 10 years ago. Willow Creek Estates. At first I thought it had to be a drafting error. But when I started checking the county parcel database, the details became impossible to ignore. The subdivision roads had been permitted 5 years earlier. Utility lines followed soon after. Building permits appeared one by one like footprints across the land. 73 houses now stood where cattle once grazed. Families had moved in. Lawns had been planted. Mailboxes installed. Someone had even built a community pool and clubhouse. All of it approved by county offices that somehow never noticed the land title had never changed hands. I opened my truck door and tossed the survey folder onto the passenger seat. The paper edges brushed my fingers again, solid and undeniable. Down the hill the white Lexus was still parked near the entrance sign, where Linda Whitmore stood watching me leave like she had just chased off a trespasser. The funny thing was she looked completely confident, like someone who had spent years believing the neighborhood behind her belonged exactly where it was. I started the engine and glanced one more time toward the rooftops spread across my grandfather's valley. 73 houses. Hundreds of people living their lives on land that had been in my family for more than 60 years. The deeper I looked into the records, the clearer one thing became. None of them had any idea how big of a mistake had been made. The next morning I was back at the county records office before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. The building smelled like old paper, floor polish, and the faint bitterness of burnt office coffee drifting from somewhere behind the counter. Fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead, while rows of metal filing cabinets stretched along the walls like something out of a courthouse archive. I had spent enough years dealing with permit offices to know that when something does not make sense on paper, the answer is usually buried somewhere deeper in the records. I signed the visitor log, nodded to the clerk behind the desk, and carried my survey folder to a wooden table near the window. Outside, the Texas sun was already warming the parking lot, but inside the room the air felt cool and still, the kind of place where decades of paperwork quietly waited for someone patient enough to read it. I started with the subdivision permits for Willow Creek Estates. 5 years ago, a development company called Barton Ridge Development filed the first construction application. The paperwork looked normal at first glance. Road plans, drainage approvals, environmental reviews. Everything stamped and signed by the county planning office. If you did not know where to look, you would think it was a routine suburban project like 100 others across Texas. But one small detail kept pulling my attention back to the same page. The legal description of the property. It referenced a parcel number that technically existed in the county tax database, but the boundary description did not match the original Carter Ranch survey from 1962. It was like someone had copied the address of the land, but never checked the actual ownership chain behind it. I leaned back in the chair and rubbed my thumb across the edge of the survey map again, feeling the slight texture of the paper under my skin. My grandfather always kept meticulous records. Every cattle purchase, every fence repair, every tax payment for that 1,000 acres was documented year after year. The Carter estate had never transferred ownership to anyone. Not to a developer, not to the county, not to an investment group. Legally speaking, the land had stayed exactly where it always had been. With us. I pulled the next stack of documents closer. Utility permits appeared 3 years after the road construction approvals. Water lines, electrical service, sewer connections approved through the county utility district. Each permit listed Willow Creek Estates as the project name. Each one referenced the same incorrect parcel number that had slipped through the system 5 years earlier. Once the first mistake was accepted, every department after that simply followed the paperwork without asking questions. It was the kind of bureaucratic domino effect that engineers see all the time. One wrong assumption quietly repeated until it becomes accepted as fact. A few pages later, I found something that made me stop turning pages altogether. The developer had filed a document claiming access through an existing ranch easement on the eastern ridge. I knew that easement well. My grandfather used it for cattle trucks to reach the highway decades ago. It was never intended to serve an entire residential neighborhood. Yet the entrance road to Willow Creek Estates had been built directly on top of it. The only road connecting 73 houses to the outside world was technically still a private Carter Ranch easement. I could almost hear my grandfather laughing at the irony of it. I closed the folder slowly and looked out the window toward the distant hills beyond the courthouse parking lot. Somewhere out there, families were walking their dogs, watering their lawns, and planning weekend barbecues without realizing the legal foundation under their neighborhood was far less solid than they believed. And standing right at the center of that misunderstanding was the confident woman in the white Lexus who had told me yesterday that I was trespassing on HOA property. The truth was much stranger than that. According to every record in front of me, Willow Creek Estates had not been built on HOA land at all. It had been built on Carter Ranch. And the only road in or out of that entire neighborhood still legally belonged to my family. By the time I stepped out of the county records building, the afternoon sun had turned the parking lot into a sheet of bright Texas heat, and the air smelled faintly like warm asphalt and dust blowing in from the hills beyond town. I sat inside my truck for a minute with the engine off, the survey folder resting on the passenger seat beside me, trying to picture the chain of decisions that had allowed an entire suburban neighborhood to grow on land that had never legally been sold. In my line of work, mistakes usually start small. A mislabeled boundary line, a survey pulled from the wrong archive, someone approving paperwork without tracing the ownership history all the way back to the original deed. One wrong assumption slides quietly into the next until 5 years later you end up with 73 houses, a swimming pool, and a homeowners association that believes it owns something it never actually purchased. I started the truck and headed back toward the valley, the highway slowly giving way to narrower county roads lined with cedar trees and limestone outcroppings. The closer I got to Willow Creek Estates, the more familiar the landscape became. I recognized the bend in the road where my grandfather used to park his cattle trailer. I passed the old windmill tower that still stood crooked against the skyline like a rusted landmark from another era. Most people driving through here would never notice those details. But to me, the land still carried the quiet memory of the ranch it used to be. When the stone entrance sign finally appeared ahead, the polished letters catching the afternoon light, the neighborhood looked exactly as peaceful as it had the day before. Sprinklers clicked steadily across the lawns. A pair of teenagers rolled past on skateboards along the sidewalk. Somewhere a lawn mower hummed steadily, the smell of fresh-cut grass drifting through the warm air. It was the kind of quiet suburban scene real estate brochures love to photograph. I parked along the gravel shoulder again and stepped out, the heat pressing against my shirt while cicadas buzzed lazily in the trees nearby. This time no one rushed over to tell me I was trespassing. The white Lexus was not in sight, and for a few minutes I simply stood there studying the entrance road that curved down into the neighborhood. Smooth black asphalt stretched along the ridge exactly where the Carter Ranch easement had been recorded decades earlier. My grandfather built that access route so cattle trucks could reach the highway without tearing up the pasture. Back then it was nothing more than compacted gravel winding through cedar brush. Now it served as the only paved road leading into an entire residential subdivision. I walked slowly toward the edge of the asphalt and crouched down, running my hand along the surface where small bits of gravel had been pressed into the pavement. Engineers learned to notice construction details without even thinking about it. The road was built well. Proper drainage slope. Clean shoulder grading. Someone had invested serious money into making sure Willow Creek Estates looked permanent. The problem was permanence means something different when the legal foundation underneath it was never actually secured. I stood up again and looked down the road as a delivery truck turned into the neighborhood and disappeared. Past the clubhouse at the far end. Dozens of families lived down there now. Children growing up. Mortgages being paid every month. HOA meetings about landscaping and fence heights probably happening every other Thursday evening. None of them had seen the county records sitting in the folder inside my truck. None of them had traced the ownership line all the way back to 1962 the way I had. And judging by the confident tone Linda Whitmore used yesterday, the Homeowners Association believed the story they had been told. That the land had been abandoned years ago. That the developer who built the neighborhood had purchased it legally. That everything sitting behind that stone entrance sign belonged to Willow Creek Estates. The quiet breeze moved through the cedar trees again, carrying the dry scent of sun-warmed grass across the ridge. I slipped my hands into my pockets and looked down the long stretch of pavement one more time. Because according to every document I had just read in the county archives, the road beneath my boots was still Carter Ranch property, which meant the entire neighborhood behind it depended on access that had never legally left my family's name. The sun had started to dip lower behind the hills when I finally climbed back into my truck, and the quiet hum of insects filled the warm evening air while the neighborhood carried on like nothing unusual had happened. A minivan rolled past the entrance sign, turning into Willow Creek Estates with a slow blink of its turn signal. A man in a baseball cap waved to a neighbor walking a golden retriever along the sidewalk. Normal life. Completely ordinary. That was the strange part. Because sitting inside the folder on my passenger seat were documents that could change everything those people believed about the ground beneath their homes. I rested my hand on the steering wheel for a moment and looked down the entrance road again. From an engineering perspective, the development had been planned well. Proper drainage ditches lined the pavement. The road crown was built to handle heavy rain runoff. Whoever designed the neighborhood had followed modern suburban standards almost perfectly. The problem was not the construction. The problem was the assumption behind it. Someone somewhere had convinced themselves that the land title had been resolved. Once that belief settled into the paperwork, every department simply continued the process. Surveyors mapped the lots. Utility companies ran power lines and water mains. The developer sold houses to families who trusted the system had verified everything already. That kind of administrative momentum is powerful. Once construction begins, it becomes harder for anyone to imagine the foundation could be wrong. I opened the survey folder again and unfolded the map across the passenger seat. The bold boundary lines still framed the valley exactly as they had 60 years ago. Carter Ranch. 1,000 acres. No transfer of ownership. No subdivision approval connected to our deed. Just a quiet piece of history that somehow slipped through the cracks while a modern neighborhood grew on top of it. My grandfather used to say land teaches patience better than anything else. You can rush cattle through a gate or repair a fence in a single afternoon, but the real value of land reveals itself slowly, often long after the people who bought it are gone. Sitting there in the fading sunlight, I finally understood what he meant. This situation was not something you handled with an argument on the side of the road. It required patience and precision. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out my phone, scrolling through the contact list until I found the number I had saved earlier that morning. A property attorney in Austin named Rebecca Langford. We had spoken briefly after the lawyer handling my grandfather's estate mentioned her firm specialized in complicated land disputes. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear while a warm breeze drifted through the open window carrying the faint scent of cedar and dry grass. She answered on the third ring with a calm professional voice that immediately reminded me why experienced attorneys are worth their hourly rate. I explained the situation slowly, describing the Carter Ranch deed, the subdivision permits, and the easement road leading into Willow Creek Estates. There was a brief pause on the line after I finished. Then I heard a quiet breath of disbelief on the other end. She asked me to repeat the acreage and the year of the original deed, just to be sure she had heard correctly. When I confirmed the details, her tone shifted from curiosity to something closer to cautious amazement. According to her experience, situations like this were extremely rare, but not impossible. Large estates tied up in probate sometimes created windows where developers assumed ownership had been abandoned. If no one checked the title history carefully enough, mistakes could move through the system unnoticed. I glanced down the hill again, where porch lights were beginning to glow as evening settled over the neighborhood. Children laughed somewhere near the clubhouse, while sprinklers clicked steadily across the lawns. Rebecca's voice returned through the phone with a quiet seriousness. She told me the most important thing right now was not to confront anyone directly. No arguments with the homeowners association. No legal threats yet. The first step was documentation and verification through official channels. I closed the survey folder slowly and rested it on the seat beside me again. Down the hill, the entire neighborhood looked peaceful under the golden light of sunset. 73 houses, dozens of families, an entire community built on the belief that everything beneath it had been settled years ago. Rebecca was right about one thing, though. If the records were as clear as they appeared, this was not just a paperwork mistake. It was the beginning of a very complicated conversation about land that had never actually changed owners. 2 days later, the valley looked exactly the same from the hill above Willow Creek Estates, but the way I looked at it had changed completely. Morning sunlight rolled slowly across the rooftops while thin fog lifted off the lower pastureland, and the quiet neighborhood below was waking up like any normal suburban community. Garage doors hummed open one by one. A jogger moved steadily along the sidewalk near the clubhouse. Somewhere a dog barked once and then settled down again. It was calm, ordinary, almost peaceful. But sitting on the passenger seat of my truck was a new folder thicker than the first one, and inside it were documents that made the situation far more serious than I had realized the first afternoon. Rebecca Langford had moved quickly. By the next morning, she had already requested a full title history review from the county recorder's office and ordered an independent survey verification from a firm her office trusted. Engineers and attorneys share one habit in common. When something looks unusual on paper, the first rule is to confirm every detail before anyone says a single word publicly. That is exactly what she had done. I opened the folder again and spread several of the pages across the dashboard while the warm smell of sun-heated grass drifted through the open truck window. The title report traced the ownership of Carter Ranch all the way back to 1962 when my grandfather purchased the property. Every tax payment had been recorded. Every renewal of the agricultural exemption was listed year after year. Even during the long probate process after my grandfather passed away, the estate had never lost its legal claim to the land. The most important page sat near the top of the stack. A certified statement from the county recorder confirming there had never been a deed transfer for the 1,000-acre parcel that included the entire valley where Willow Creek Estates now stood. In simple terms, it meant exactly what I thought it meant the first day I unfolded the survey map on my kitchen table. The neighborhood had been built on land that legally still belonged to the Carter estate. I leaned back in the seat and looked down toward the entrance road again, where a delivery van slowly turned into the subdivision and disappeared around the first curve. From up here, it was easy to see how convincing the illusion must have been. Neatly arranged streets, mailboxes standing in perfect rows, fresh landscaping around the clubhouse. 5 years of construction had turned open pasture land into something that looked permanent. That is the thing about development. Once houses appear and families move in, the land beneath them starts to feel like it has always belonged there. Most people never imagined the paperwork could tell a different story. Rebecca had called me earlier that morning with a tone of careful seriousness that told me she had reached the same conclusion I had. She explained that situations like this almost always begin with a simple administrative assumption. A developer files a preliminary survey using outdated parcel information. A planning department approves the first permit without verifying the full title chain. After that, every step forward builds on the original error. Roads get paved. Utilities get connected. Houses get sold. Years pass before anyone notices the foundation underneath the project was never legally secured. I watched the quiet neighborhood below while a light breeze moved through the cedar trees along the ridge. From the outside, everything looked perfectly stable. But inside the folder beside me was proof that the legal structure supporting Willow Creek Estates was far more fragile than anyone living there probably realized. Rebecca had given me very clear instructions before ending the call. For now, we would stay quiet. No public confrontation. No sudden legal notices. The first step was allowing her firm to finish verifying every boundary line and easement connected to Carter Ranch. Precision mattered. If we were correct, the documentation needed to be absolute before anyone approached the homeowners association or the developer responsible for building the neighborhood. I closed the folder slowly and rested it back on the seat beside me. Down the hill, sunlight glinted off the neighborhood swimming pool while children laughed somewhere near the playground. Life moved along peacefully inside Willow Creek Estates, exactly the way it had every day for the last 5 years. The only difference now was that someone finally understood the truth about the land underneath it. 3 days passed before I drove back to the ridge above Willow Creek Estates again, and by then the valley had settled into the slow rhythm of late summer. The morning sun hung bright over the hills, burning away the thin layer of mist that had collected overnight across the lower pastureland. From the hilltop, the neighborhood looked calm and orderly, the kind of place people moved to because they believed everything around them was stable and predictable. Lawns were already being watered. A school bus rolled slowly through the entrance road before disappearing between the rows of houses. The quiet routine almost made the whole situation feel unreal. But inside the folder on the seat beside me, the facts had become even clearer since Rebecca Langford's firm finished their verification work the night before. The survey team had confirmed every boundary line from the original 1962 Carter Ranch deed. Using modern satellite mapping and ground markers, they traced the 1,000-acre property exactly as it had been recorded more than 60 years ago. The results were as precise as any engineering survey I had ever reviewed. Willow Creek Estates sat squarely inside the Carter Ranch boundary. Not partially, not along the edge. The entire subdivision existed inside land that had never legally transferred ownership. I rested my arm along the open truck window and watched the morning light slide across the rooftops below while a warm breeze carried the faint scent of cedar trees and dry grass across the ridge. It was a peaceful scene, but the paperwork beside me told a very different story. Rebecca had called early that morning to explain the final step in the verification process. Her firm had also reviewed the original development filings submitted by Barton Ridge Development 5 years earlier. The mistake had started exactly where she suspected it might. The developer's preliminary survey had referenced a neighboring parcel number that belonged to a smaller property adjacent to the Carter Ranch boundary. Somewhere during the early paperwork phase, the boundary lines had been shifted slightly on the planning documents. Once the county planning office approved the first infrastructure permit, every department that followed simply relied on the same incorrect reference. Roads were paved. Utilities were installed. Construction permits were issued one by one as houses began to rise across land that legally remained part of my grandfather's ranch. Rebecca explained that none of those approvals automatically transferred ownership of the land itself. Permits allow construction. They do not replace a legally recorded deed. I looked down the entrance road again, where 2 children rode bicycles along the sidewalk, while a homeowner carried groceries from the back of an SUV into his garage. 5 years of normal life had taken place inside Willow Creek Estates, while the legal reality remained hidden in county archives and title records. According to Rebecca, the situation was no longer a question of whether the land belonged to the Carter estate. That had been confirmed beyond doubt. The real question now was how the correction would unfold. Situations like this required careful legal navigation because dozens of families had purchased homes believing the developer had secured the property properly. Most homeowners were innocent participants who trusted the system to verify land ownership before construction began. Rebecca made one thing very clear, though. The developer who built the subdivision would eventually have to answer difficult questions about how the project moved forward without a valid title transfer. I reached over and closed the folder again while the quiet hum of the neighborhood continued below the ridge. Sunlight glinted off the pool near the clubhouse while a landscaper guided a riding mower along one of the front lawns. Everything looked normal from a distance. But now every document had been verified and every boundary line confirmed. Willow Creek Estates had been built entirely inside Carter Ranch. And for the first time since the houses appeared in this valley, someone finally knew the truth about the land beneath them. By the end of that week, the valley had settled into the golden quiet of early evening when the Texas sun begins to soften and the long shadows stretch across the hills. I parked my truck in the same spot along the ridge where the old Carter Ranch road had once run, the tires crunching lightly against gravel that had probably not been disturbed in years before the neighborhood arrived. From that hill, the entire subdivision spread out below like a carefully drawn blueprint come to life. Streetlights had started to flicker on along the sidewalks. Porch lights glowed softly across the rows of houses. The smell of barbecue drifted faintly through the air from somewhere near the middle of the neighborhood, and the distant sound of laughter carried up the hill on a warm breeze. It was the kind of peaceful evening scene that made the situation almost feel impossible. Families were living normal lives down there, completely unaware that the land beneath them had never legally left my grandfather's name. The folder beside me was thicker now than it had been the first day I stood here. Rebecca Langford's firm had compiled every document needed to move forward. Title verification, survey confirmation, easement records, even the original 1962 purchase contract my grandfather signed when he bought the 1,000 acres. The evidence was complete and precise. Rebecca had spent most of the afternoon explaining the next phase while I sat at my kitchen table earlier that day. The process would begin quietly but formally. Her office had prepared a legal notice confirming the Carter Estates' ownership of the land and the access easement currently serving as the entrance road to Willow Creek Estates. That notice would first be delivered to Barton Ridge Development, the company responsible for building the subdivision. According to Rebecca, developers typically carry insurance and legal protections specifically for situations involving title disputes. In many cases, the developer negotiates a settlement or land purchase once ownership is confirmed. What made this case unusual was the scale of the mistake. An entire neighborhood had been constructed before anyone realized the land title had never changed hands. I watched a pair of headlights move slowly through the subdivision streets as someone returned home for the evening. 5 years of life had unfolded down there under the assumption everything was properly secured. Mortgages had been signed. Deeds for individual houses had been recorded. Homeowners association meetings had probably debated landscaping rules and mailbox colors without anyone ever questioning the original land ownership. Rebecca had emphasized something important before ending our conversation. The goal was not to disrupt families who had purchased homes in good faith. Most of the homeowners had nothing to do with the mistake that allowed the development to move forward. The responsibility would fall primarily on the developer and the legal chain that approved the project without confirming the land title. I stepped out of the truck and leaned against the door while the warm evening air moved through the cedar trees along the ridge. From up here, the neighborhood looked calm and permanent, like it had always been part of the valley. But the documents inside that folder told the real story. Willow Creek Estates existed because one incorrect parcel reference slipped through the system 5 years ago. Now every record had been verified and every boundary confirmed. The land still belonged to Carter Ranch. Rebecca's legal notice would be delivered the following morning. After that, the developer would finally see the same documents I had been studying all week. I looked down the entrance road again where streetlights reflected softly off the pavement that followed the old ranch easement into the neighborhood. That road had once carried cattle trucks through open pasture land. Now it served 73 homes built on land no one had ever legally purchased. The valley grew quiet as the last sunlight disappeared behind the hills. Tomorrow, the people responsible for building Willow Creek Estates would learn something the entire neighborhood had never imagined. The ground beneath those houses had a history older than the subdivision itself, and for the first time since the development began, someone was about to bring that history back into the light. The next morning arrived clear and quiet. The kind of Texas morning where the sky looks impossibly wide and the air carries that dry scent of sun-warmed grass long before the heat fully settles across the valley. I stood once again on the ridge above Willow Creek Estates. watching the neighborhood come to life as the first light of day slid across the rooftops and reflected off the windows of houses that had been built here over the past 5 years. A sprinkler clicked steadily across one lawn near the entrance. A garage door lifted slowly somewhere near the clubhouse. From a distance, the neighborhood looked exactly the way it had every other morning since construction finished. Calm, orderly, permanent. But the difference today was that the truth about the land underneath it had finally reached the people responsible for building it. Rebecca Langford called just after sunrise while I was standing beside the truck with the valley spread out below me. Her voice carried the calm confidence of someone who had already anticipated how the conversation would unfold. The legal notice had been delivered early that morning to Barton Ridge Development, along with the complete documentation package her firm prepared. Title history, survey verification, certified ownership confirmation from the county recorder. Every document pointed to the same unavoidable conclusion. The 1,000 acres that formed the valley beneath Willow Creek Estates had never been sold by the Carter estate. There was a long pause on the line while she described the reaction from the developer's legal team. At first they believed it must be a misunderstanding. That was apparently the exact word used when they called her office less than an hour after receiving the notice. But misunderstandings do not usually come with 60 years of recorded tax payments and a verified boundary survey confirming the land ownership. Rebecca explained that once their attorneys reviewed the documents, the tone of the conversation shifted quickly from disbelief to cautious negotiation. Situations like this rarely go to court when the evidence is that clear. Developers understand the cost of litigation when the ownership chain is already verified beyond doubt. I looked down the entrance road again, while a school bus rolled slowly through the neighborhood, carrying children toward the highway beyond the ridge. The quiet, normal routine continued below while the legal conversation about the land moved forward somewhere in offices far away from the valley itself. Rebecca told me the developer had already requested a formal meeting later that week. Their insurance providers and legal advisors would likely be involved because the scale of the development made the situation impossible to ignore. 73 homes, roads, utilities, a clubhouse, millions of dollars in construction sitting on land that legally belonged to someone else. I leaned against the truck and watched. Sunlight moved slowly across the roofs below while her voice continued through the phone. The goal now was resolution rather than conflict. The developer had two realistic options according to Rebecca. They could negotiate a purchase of the Carter Ranch land covering the subdivision, or they could attempt a complicated relocation or restructuring of the project that would cost far more than the land itself. In most cases, the practical solution is negotiation. I thanked her for the update and ended the call while the quiet morning breeze moved gently through the cedar trees along the ridge. Down below, the neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had the day construction crews first arrived years ago. Families walking dogs, cars leaving driveways. The simple rhythm of daily life continuing without interruption. But now the people who built Willow Creek Estates understood something they had never realized when the first permit was filed 5 years earlier. The valley beneath their neighborhood had never been empty land waiting for development. It had always belonged to Carter Ranch. My grandfather used to say that land has a long memory, even when people forget the details written in old records and faded maps. Standing there on the ridge, I finally understood what he meant. Because the valley below had quietly held the truth for more than 60 years. And now, after all that time, the history of that land had finally caught up with the neighborhood built on top of it.